The walls at his Bay Street office may be granite, but Bencher candidate 2019 E. Patrick Shea is anything but stony-faced. He gave me a primer on the Law Society of Ontario budget and emphasized the need to make tough choices going forward.
I use E. Patrick Shea because, believe it or not, there is another Patrick Shea out there practicing law. He's not
Somehow,
a Bencher candidate.
I believe it.
And in my spare time, the last few years, I've been working on efforts to get the law students that were killed in World War I and World War II admitted to the profession posthumously across the country. So there were a remarkable number of law students who enlisted for service in World War I and never came back from every province. And in 2014, the Law Society of Ontario gave honorary calls to their law students. So I prepared biographies and located families for those students. And last year, 2007, the Law Society of Ontario gave honorary calls to the World War II law students who were killed. And I also prepared biographies for them and located their families. Most recently, Alberta gave posthumous calls to their law students, and other provinces are now considering it. So my goal ultimately is to receive some sort of recognition for the law students across the country who were lost in World War I and World War II. So they set aside their studies. Their families, in some cases, sacrificed quite a bit to get them into law school, and they never came back.
So in doing that research, I'm sure you've come across a lot of interesting stories and histories. Does anything stand out to you?
I think the one that stands out to me the most is from Newfoundland. And it was a young woman whose uncle was the Attorney General, and she wanted to become a lawyer. Her uncle sought to have the Law Society at the time change their rules to allow her to become a law student because women were not allowed to practice. And the Law Society refused. He was the Attorney General. He passed legislation that made them admit women. She was then articling at his office, and when the war began, her fiancé, who later became her husband, and her brother went overseas with the Newfoundland Regiment. She followed them and worked with an organization I'm involved in, St. John Ambulance, as a medical attendant, assisting individuals who came back to England wounded. She lost her husband at Beaumont Hamel in that tragedy that befell the Newfoundland Regiment, and her brother died of pneumonia as a result of his service. So she came back and never actually finished her legal studies. Well, the Law Society of Newfoundland gave her an honorary call, not because she was killed in the war, but because she did not complete her studies as a result of the war. So 70 years after she died, the Law Society of Newfoundland gave her what her uncle and she fought for so hard, admission to the legal profession, which I thought was pretty special.
That's a very nice story. So thank you very much for meeting with me on a Sunday.
Anytime.
I would like to talk a little bit about your campaign platform. And I noticed that one of your priorities is tuition. And
yes.
What was the landscape when you graduated from law school?
Well, I tweeted about this probably yesterday or the day before. I went to law school. I graduated in '93. I came out with very little student debt. Certainly what I had was very manageable. And I paid my way through law school by summering with the Canadian Forces Reserves. I taught cadets how to fly airplanes. So I would work for about 8 weeks in the summer. And I had a part-time job as a lifeguard at the university pool. And those two jobs allowed me to pay my tuition, my books, my rent, and my food through the course of the year. I took a very, very small student debt that I was carrying when I got out, and that gave me freedom. So I was fortunate to get a job here on Bay Street, but I think what was most important to me is I didn't need to get a job on Bay Street. I could have worked anywhere. For the area I wished to practice in, Bay Street was the natural choice, but I could have worked anywhere, and it also gave me the flexibility. So I didn't travel between high school and university, and I didn't travel between university and law school, but I took 2 years off and lived in Japan. What's happening now is I see students coming out with massive debts. Their real only choice to pay off those debts is Bay Street, and they're all hoping for a job on Bay Street. But Bay Street is not, first of all, the BN, it's not the best place to work necessarily for all people. And it also doesn't have the same opportunities that it once had. I mean, I think the profession is under challenge, and I don't know how much longer we're going to be able to absorb the number of students that we're absorbing now. And that's going to put students in a position where they're not going to be able to pay off this debt. They're not going to be able to service this debt. And I honestly think that that will lead to people opting out of the profession. And what I mean by that is people will look at the generation ahead of them. People have friends. They'll talk to their friends. And people that come from blue-collar or working-class backgrounds are not going to choose the legal profession. So it's not a situation where they're not going to be able to get in. It's they're going to choose not to go to law school because they're not prepared to incur the debt they can't pay back. And if their parents don't have the means to provide them with money, they're going to opt out. They're going to choose something else to do.
And I think we agree that it's not the Law Society who can control tuition at the school level. So how do you envision supporting these students, recent grads? What do you think the role of the Law Society should be?
Well, I don't think the Law Society not only can't it, but it shouldn't interfere. It's a business decision of the universities how much they want to charge. And they will charge what they think they can. Eventually, if students stop attending or stop enrolling, they'll have to adjust that tuition. But I think what the Law Society can do is deal with it at a fee level. So, for example, there could be, and I think should be, fee reductions for students who are unable to meet their economic obligations or who are having financial issues. Some jurisdictions have fee rebates of up to 50% for lawyers, both young and old, who earn below a certain threshold. So you pay your fees, and in the subsequent year, you can ask for a rebate if you've earned less than X. Those are some of the ways. We can also ease the transition into the profession by providing things like forgivable loans or that sort of thing for lawyers who are prepared to go to underserviced communities or who want to go to underserviced communities. What we're seeing, I think, in places, I come from Northern Ontario, what we're seeing in places like Northern Ontario is the lawyers in the communities are getting older. They're not taking on articling students. People are not moving into those communities and starting to practice. So those communities are going to become horribly underserviced. And that provides an opportunity, but the income levels that can be earned in those communities is not sufficient to pay off a lot of student debt. So I think by encouraging students to move to those communities, encouraging lawyers in those communities to provide articling positions by providing funding, whether by way of grants or forgivable loans, we can encourage students to move there. We can encourage students to practice there by easing the financial burden. Because I think what's keeping people from some of these communities is the inability to earn an income. They're all trying to come to Bay Street or Ottawa or other places like that.
I think that you've hit on a very important point, and I've seen it myself, where a recent call wants to get some experience under their belt, can't afford to pay the licensing fees and the insurance in order to do contract work or agency gigs, then can't get a job because they lack experience, and it ends up being a very vicious cycle.
Remember, there is funding available in the sense that the Law Society is not the only source of funding for access to justice. The Law Foundation has a specific mandate and a specific fund to facilitate access. And I view some of these issues as access issues. If a community doesn't have a lawyer, that means the individuals in that community don't have access to legal services or legal advice. And all communities have issues, whether it's criminal issues, family issues, small business issues. The issues exist. And for those individuals in those communities, I mean, the town I come from is lucky. We have 2 lawyers in the community, but the town beside us, and beside us I mean 45 minutes away, doesn't have any lawyers. So individuals in that community have to travel 45 minutes to obtain legal advice if they want to meet a lawyer in person.
Can you tell us a little bit about the nature of your practice?
Sure. I have a bit of a mixed practice. So I'm a commercial insolvency lawyer. So I do both litigation at the motion and application level. I don't do trials. And I do commercial work on the M&A side of things. So I act for both the purchasers and the buyers of businesses. And then I have a bit of a niche in that I advise foreign governments on the development of legislation. So I advise right now I'm advising the Jamaican government and the St. Lucia government on the development of some pieces of legislation.
One of the things I've observed in your platform, you mention investment reserves and the Law Society's use of investment reserves. I don't come from any sort of financial background, so can you explain for those listening what you mean by that?
Sure. Over the years, the Law Society has built up a reserve of cash. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe now it's about $27 million. Those reserves, and most organizations, most corporations maintain cash reserves to deal with specific projects, specific issues. When you're budgeting, it is not ideal but acceptable, in my view, to use the interest earned on those reserves to fund operations. It's not acceptable or advisable, in my view, to eat into the capital. And what I mean by eating into the capital is eroding the base amount of the reserves. And what's happening in the Law Society is that to fund all of the projects and all of the initiatives while keeping the fees low, what we're doing is we're making use of that reserve. So we're eroding the reserve to the tune of millions of dollars. And that's been happened last year, it's happening this year, and it's going to happen next year. And what that does is it means that the Law Society will have less money, less capital available for anything that arises in the future. And again, we're not using it to fund capital expenditure or specific projects. I have no issue with using capital, so reserves, to fund specific projects or capital acquisition. But we're using it to fund operations. And operations don't create anything.
So how do we fix that while at the same time being mindful of some of the pressure of high fees on recent calls and practitioners below a certain income level?
We have to make choices, and we have to make difficult choices. And the choices involve, are we going to continue to do these projects? Are we going to continue to undertake these initiatives? Are we going to continue to spend at the level we're spending? In which case, we have to have a closer look at the fee model, because it's clear to me that this level of spending is only sustainable with increases in fees. And increases in fees create issues for younger practitioners, sole practitioners, and practitioners in smaller communities. So we have to balance that. We have to look at, are all these projects important to us? Are all these initiatives important to us? And I have to say, when I look at it, I think most of them are fairly important. Mm-hmm. But then we have to make the decision, how are we going to fund them? And I also want to point out that when you're looking at the budget, CPD drives a fairly big percentage of the revenue for the Law Society. And they're counting on CPD, they're counting on increases in the fees that lawyers pay. So they're counting on more lawyers coming into the profession. And I don't know that that's a reasonable assumption going forward. I don't know whether the profession can frankly absorb 1,000 new lawyers a year. And we're counting on increases in the fees that students pay. I don't think we're counting on actually charging students more, but we're counting on more students coming into the qualification program that will generate more revenue. Some of those things have to be looked at and some decisions have to be made.
Do you have any specific thoughts on CPD and how it should figure into the budget? Should it continue to be a revenue driver, or is it more about providing access to knowledge and competence?
Well, I think my view on CPD is I'm internally conflicted. And what I mean by that is I don't personally think the Law Society should be in the CPD business. I think that's something that should be done by the Canadian Bar Association and the local law associations. And I don't think the Law Society should be competing with them in the provision of CPD. That being said, such a large, not massive, but a large percentage of the budget is based on the CPD revenue. And I tried to do the math, and assuming that all of the expenses associated with CPD were eliminated at the same time as the Law Society stopped CPD, if that was the decision, lawyer fees would have to go up by $100 a year to make up the revenue shortfall. It's not a small amount of money for a small practitioner. It sounds small, but for some practitioners, that's not small.
So I understand that you grew up in a northern community. How does that affect your perspective on reconciliation?
I think it affects me in an interesting way, in the sense that I grew up in an environment where Indigenous communities were close by, and I encountered Indigenous individuals in school in my normal everyday life. So I actually saw how they lived, and I don't know how to put it correctly, how years of lack of attention to their needs, how years of
systemic discrimination,
sure, impacted their lives on the ground. The fact that there are communities in Canada that don't have running water, the fact that there are communities where nutritious, healthy food is so expensive that your average family can't afford it. The fact that a hockey team from some areas in northern Ontario have to charter a plane to fly to a tournament in Ottawa, and there's no funding available for that. Those are the sort of things that, for me, are real on-the-ground issues. One of the organizations I'm involved with is developing a first aid program for delivery in remote Indigenous communities, and it's about providing first aid and mental first aid training to Indigenous people delivered by Indigenous people. We're providing Indigenous trainers to provide first aid because the incidence of suicide in the reservations is unacceptable to me. So while I fully accept, matter of fact, I endorse discussion about reconciliation, reconciliation also has to be by action. So lawyers are in a position to do things. We have influence in the community. Some of us have financial resources. Those need to be deployed towards reconciliation, towards helping to bring some of these problems to an end. And I think I said in my platform, why should we build atriums or classrooms when we can provide rinks?
Another aspect of governance that's come up during this election is the question of campaign budgets and spending. Do you have any thoughts on that issue?
I think that the cost of running a campaign places becoming a venture out of the reach of a lot of people. I don't know what the numbers are, and I would certainly advocate for, after this election, the benchers that are elected being required to disclose how much money they spent directly and indirectly getting elected, so that we can assess whether that in and of itself presents a barrier to entry. For example, and I'm not saying everything is prohibitively expensive. So I built my own website, and I spent, I'll tell you the number, I spent $120 buying the license, I guess, or to use, and getting my own name. But that's only part of it. I've never built a website before, so I spent 2.5 days building it. That's time out of my practice. That's time not billing. So there's more than just the financial outlay for advertising. There's the time that's spent building websites, producing materials. And that sort of thing may present barriers that we need to address. Maybe we put caps on spending. Maybe we put in place a fund that younger practitioners can draw on to fund advertising or marketing. Maybe we put in place uniform marketing so that the Law Society buys ads for everybody. Not full page flashy color ads, but everyone's name is presented. What I'd like to see is elections decided on platforms, not name recognition, not incumbency, and certainly not based on money.
Are there issues we haven't covered in our discussion that you would like to express to anyone listening?
No, I don't think so. I think that you've covered off, I think, the key issues, and I think some of those issues are common to both of our views. And I think a lot of those issues are shared by a great number of lawyers. I think for me, the most important message to get out to lawyers is log on and vote based on platforms. Take the time to read the voting guide, take time to learn about the candidates, and cast your vote that way. Don't just cast a vote for a name you recognize. Cast a vote for what you believe in and what the platform stands for.
This has been fantastic. Again, really grateful that you gave some time on a Sunday to sit with us and chat about your platform.
Well, this sort of thing I think is good for all the candidates. And what I really like to encourage candidates that are on Twitter to do is pick a candidate, any candidate, not your friend, not someone you know, any candidate. Look at who they are, look at their platform, and tweet about them for a little bit. Let's get the attention out for everybody, because this is, again, about platforms, not about name recognition.
And we have such an opportunity with social media being what it is to really engage with the issues. And although articling students and students don't have a vote, this affects them as well, so they can be part of the conversation. There's a lot of opportunity for dialogue here, and I hope that we take advantage of that.
There are 50,000 lawyers out there, and the goal has to be to reflect not only what's in the public interest, but what they think is important.
If someone wants to learn more about your candidacy, how do they get in touch?
Sure. So I have a website, www.shea4bencher, 4 as in number, 2019.com. That's for my website. And I'm also on Twitter, and I have a Facebook account and a LinkedIn account, so people can learn about me there. And also, there are various great organizations that are publishing the platforms for the candidates, and I have put my platform up in all of those.
Which, by the way, I commend. I don't know how you've managed to carve out time to answer all of these really in-depth questions, but you do so in a very thoughtful, insightful way. So thank you for contributing that.
Don't know whether you're going to put this in or not, but the reason I have so much time is I have no children.
Also, can I ask, what does the E stand for?
Oh, E stands for Earl. It's my father's name, and when I was a kid, I didn't want to be called Junior, so I started using Patrick, which is my middle name.
The Bencher Election 2019 for the Law Society of Ontario takes place from April 15th to 30th. If you're out of Ontario, why not look at what's happening in your region? If you know someone who's practicing, see what they're up to. Encourage them to vote. Check me out on Twitter at Karima Rules.